The Ghost Town. I remember the first time I heard about Willow Creek. It was my grandmother who brought it up, though it was more in a warning than a story. I was only a kid then, hanging on her every word as she spoke about that strange town in the valley where, as she put it, everyone just disappeared. I thought she was joking, but my grandmother's voice turned somber, her gaze drifting to some distant memory. Years passed, and I'd all but forgotten her story until my friend Charlie showed up one evening, bursting with excitement about a new urban exploration trip. A ghost town, he said, just a couple of hours' drive away. "You ever heard of Willow Creek?" he asked. I froze. "Everyone disappeared there, right?" I said, trying to play it off with a smirk. Charlie laughed it off too, but something in my chest tightened. He saw my hesitation and brushed it aside. "Come on, man, it's a legend," he insisted. "Just some old story. Don't you want to see it for yourself?" The next thing I knew, we were loading supplies into his Jeep, preparing for an overnight stay. We packed flashlights, food, extra batteries, and, just in case, a couple of cameras. I dabbled in photography, so Charlie figured it would be my job to document our discovery. We set out before sunrise, the road twisting through forest that grew denser the closer we got to Willow Creek. There was a thick fog hanging over the trees, casting shadows that seemed to stretch and shift in the morning light. I told myself it was just the early hour, the sleep still wearing off, but a feeling settled in my gut, a feeling that said we shouldn't be here. Finally, we came to a gravel path that led down into the valley. At the bottom, surrounded by thick forest, lay the ghost town. It was eerie in the daylight, buildings leaning into each other like tired, silent sentries. The streets were empty, littered with leaves and debris, and every window was dark, giving off an unsettling, vacant stare. We parked, stepping out into a thick silence. Not even the birds were singing. As we walked into the center of town, our footsteps echoed off the abandoned storefronts, the old houses, and the broken-down cars rusting in driveways. It was like a snapshot frozen in time, a moment preserved but slowly decaying. Charlie slapped me on the back, grinning. "What do you think? Creepy, right?" I nodded, swallowing hard. "Yeah, creepy." We started our exploration at an old diner near the main square. The windows were grimy, but through them, I could make out faded booths and cracked linoleum floors. When we stepped inside, the air was thick, carrying the stale scent of mold and dust. Plates sat on the tables, as if someone had just abandoned their meal mid-bite. Some still held the crumbling remains of food, though it was blackened and dried beyond recognition. Charlie was snapping pictures, his footsteps clanging on the tiles as he moved toward the counter. I wandered to the back, where I noticed something odd. Scrawled across the wall, almost like scratches, were the words, "It watches. It waits." A chill ran down my spine, but I tried to shake it off. Old graffiti, probably a prank. I forced a laugh, though it sounded hollow in the silence. Charlie looked over, noticing my unease. "Hey, you all right?" he asked, genuinely concerned. Yeah, just a little unnerving, that's all." We moved from building to building. The grocery store still had cans lined up on the shelves, though they were rusted and bulging. The schoolhouse was filled with desks, some toppled over, as though students had fled mid-lesson. Each building told a story of abandonment, of lives interrupted. Yet there was something else, a heaviness, like the very walls were watching us, listening. As night began to fall, we returned to the center of town where we'd set up a small camp. We'd brought tents, though I wasn't sure I'd be able to sleep in this place. Something about the town had started to gnaw at me, a feeling of being unwelcome. But Charlie didn't seem to notice, laughing and chatting as if we were on a regular camping trip. After a quick meal, we settled by a small fire. The shadows cast by the flames flickered across the empty storefronts, giving them a life they hadn't seen in years. As I sat there, staring into the darkness, I thought I saw a figure standing in the distance, just at the edge of the fire's light. "Did you see that?" I whispered, nudging Charlie. He followed my gaze, but shook his head. "Nothing's there, man. Just shadows," he said, though he sounded less certain. I lay down, trying to calm my racing heart, telling myself it was just my imagination. But as I drifted off, I heard something, a faint whisper, almost like a sigh. I sat up, looking around, but all was still. Yet, the feeling of being watched grew stronger. In the early hours of the morning, I woke to the sound of footsteps outside the tent. I nudged Charlie awake, signaling for him to be quiet. We listened, frozen, as the footsteps circled us, slow and deliberate. When they stopped, I dared to peek out, my heart hammering. The fire had burned down to embers, casting a faint glow, but in the flickering light, I saw them, figures standing in the windows of the buildings surrounding the square. Dozens of them, their forms faint and translucent, watching us. They didn't move, didn't speak, just stared. I ducked back inside, whispering frantically to Charlie, "There's people watching us." People? No way. He sounded half asleep, but the terror in my voice woke him. He peeked out, and I saw the color drain from his face. "What? What is this place?" he whispered, as the realization dawned on him. We'd stepped into something far darker than we could have imagined. At dawn, we packed our things, ready to leave. The figures had vanished with the first light, but their presence lingered. As we hurried to the Jeep, something compelled me to turn back, one last time. In the window of the diner, scratched into the glass, were the same words I'd seen scrawled on the wall inside. "It watches. It waits." The drive back was silent. Neither of us spoke, each of us lost in our own thoughts. But as we left the valley, I couldn't shake the feeling that we hadn't left it behind, that something from Willow Creek was coming with us. That night, back in my apartment, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw their faces, their eyes fixed on me, hollow and knowing. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just nerves, but the whispers began to creep in. At first, they were faint, almost imperceptible, like a breath against my ear. But they grew louder, more insistent. I could hear them calling my name, begging me to return. Shadows moved in the corners of my room, and every mirror reflected the ghostly figures from Willow Creek, standing behind me, watching, waiting. The days blurred into one another. Charlie stopped responding to my calls, and eventually I learned he'd vanished from his apartment, leaving everything behind. I tried to reach out to others, but no one believed me. No one could hear the whispers. No one else saw the figures in their mirrors. I returned to Willow Creek, drawn back by a force I couldn't resist. The town was the same, silent and empty, yet filled with a presence I could feel in every step. I wandered the streets, the whispers now a constant chorus, guiding me back to the diner, to the message scrawled on the wall. "It watches. It waits. And in that moment, I understood Willow Creek hadn't been abandoned. Its inhabitants had simply changed, becoming part of the town's shadows, its silence. The town wasn't just haunted, it was alive, feeding off those who dared enter, pulling them into its endless, quiet depths. And now, I am one of them, a shadow in the windows, a whisper in the silence, waiting for the next soul to wander into the ghost town of Willow Creek.